This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and having read through Chapter 1 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Prior Analytics, I'd like to offer students a bit of help in reading through and understanding the content of Chapter 1. This is the first chapter, the opening chapter of the Prior Analytics, and in this opening chapter, Aristotle wants to clarify the subject of this book. And he does this explicitly in this opening chapter. He tells us right in the first sentence, the subject of this present treatise is concerning demonstration. Demonstration, proving things, is the subject of this treatise on prior analytics. And the purpose of this treatise, Aristotle says, it is for the sake of demonstrative science. That is, Aristotle intends in this treatise to teach us the art of demonstrative reasoning in a scientific way. The purpose of prior analytics is to teach us the science of demonstrative reasoning. Now, in order to teach us this science, what Aristotle intends to teach us is the doctrine of the syllogism. Prior analytics teaches us the doctrine of the syllogism. In order to explain to us the syllogism, Aristotle needs to make sure we understand all of the ideas which make up the parts of the doctrine of the syllogism. Because if we don't understand the different parts which he's going to use in this treatise, there's no way for us to understand what he's going to be teaching. So he takes time in this first chapter to explain an important set of terms and ideas that need to be understood in order to understand the subject of this book. He says, it is requisite to define what a proposition is. And so as you study, if you want to set goals for your study, goal number 1 is that when you're finished with chapter 1, you should be able to explain what a proposition is. You need to learn the definition of a proposition, not from a dictionary, but from Aristotle's instruction here in this book. What is a proposition? Next, he says, what a term. Second goal of this study is to make sure you understand what a term is. What is a term? And next, what is a syllogism? That's likely a new word, a new vocabulary word for you, and we're going to see it constantly in our studies. So you need to answer the question, what is a syllogism? After that, he says we need to learn how to identify the two different kinds of syllogisms. The first kind of syllogism, he says, is perfect, a perfect syllogism. And the second kind of syllogism, he says, is an imperfect syllogism. So we want to understand what a syllogism is, and we want to understand what a perfect syllogism is, and what an imperfect syllogism is. He then says, in the next place, it must be shown what it is for a thing to be or not to be in a certain whole, and what we say it is to be predicated of everything or of nothing, of a certain multitude. At the end of that sentence, his introduction ends. And he gets started with the work of explaining the meaning of these different concepts. He starts with the proposition. He tells us a proposition is a sentence affirming or denying something of something. And there are a few important notes that you should make. A proposition is a kind of sentence. A proposition is one kind of sentence. It's a sentence that affirms or denies something. It's a sentence that is either true or false. It affirms or denies something. A proposition is not a question. A proposition is not a command. A proposition is not a wish or a prayer. A proposition is a sentence that affirms or denies something of something. It affirms or denies something. That is, it states a predicate. It predicates something of something. A proposition predicates concerning a subject. He then teaches us that there are a few different kinds of propositions. Remember, a proposition is one kind of sentence, but there are different kinds of propositions as well. He tells us there are 3 different kinds of propositions. He says there is a universal proposition, a particular proposition, and an indefinite proposition. Universal, particular, and indefinite. In this sentence, there is a bit of confusion in Taylor's translation. If you read the translation, it says, a proposition is universal either in a part or indefinite. That's not clear, that sentence. You should read that sentence as, a proposition is universal or particular or indefinite. One source of confusion to make sure you avoid. He then explains what these 3 different kinds of propositions are. He says, I denominate universal. Aristotle's telling us, when I use the word universal, this is what I mean. I denominate universal the being present with everything or nothing. A proposition that predicates something of all the members of a class of things or none of the members of a class of things. All or nothing is a universal proposition. It makes a statement about an entire class of subjects. Like, all men are mortal creatures, and no men are winged creatures. Those are examples of universal propositions. He then says particular propositions, the being present with something, or not with something, or not with everything. A particular proposition is one that predicates something of a part of a class of things. One or more, but not all, and not none. It predicates something being present with something or not with something. Particular propositions. And then lastly, the indefinite. The indefinite proposition, the being present or not being present without the universal or particular. And what that means is that if we have a proposition that affirms or denies something of something, but it doesn't explicitly say if the predication is being made of all of the class or of none of the class or even of some of the class. If it's not made clear, it's not stated whether we're speaking of all or none or some. There's simply no qualifying term to limit the proposition. Then we call it an indefinite proposition, an unlimited, a proposition that doesn't give us, that doesn't define the subject in terms of quantity. He then goes on to talk about a different division of propositions. At first, he talks about universal, particular, and indefinite propositions. Then he goes on to talk about demonstrative and dialectic propositions, two different kinds of propositions with regard to something else. He says a demonstrative proposition differs from a dialectic proposition in this. The demonstrative proposition is an assumption of one part of a contradiction. A demonstrative proposition is an assumption of one part of a contradiction, and this is very easy to understand. We start with a problem, whether God exists or not, and there we see a contradiction. God exists or God does not exist. There's only two options. We have this contradiction. A demonstrative proposition assumes or takes up one of the two options of that contradiction. It either assumes that God exists or it assumes God does not exist. A demonstrative proposition takes one side of a contradiction. In other words, you choose your answer and then work with that answer. This is what we do when we write an essay, for example. Or if you have a disputation assignment and you need to create a thesis, you need to answer some controversial question, a contradiction like we read here. You need to take your position and then you need to prove and defend your position. The taking up of that thesis, the choosing your answer, is what it means to assume one part of a contradiction. But a dialectic proposition is something different. There's a different kind of proposition. The dialectic proposition is an interrogation of contradiction, not an assumption of one part of a contradiction, but an interrogation of contradiction. This is what we refer to in the Socratic method. When Socrates questions men, he asks them a question which presents a contradiction. The man must choose yes or no. He must affirm or deny. The man who is leading the investigation does not assume one side of a contradiction, but he interrogates, he asks, he presents the contradiction in the form of a question. And the person with which he speaks is the one who assumes one part of the contradiction. This is why Aristotle says that as pertains to the framing a syllogism from either kind of proposition, as regards the actual constructing of a syllogism, it doesn't matter. It's the same for both of these. He says the one in no respect differs from the other as regards putting together a syllogism, which we'll learn about in just a minute. And he explains, he who demonstrates and he who interrogates in this way both syllogize, assuming that something is present with or not present with something. Hence, a syllogistic proposition will be simply an affirmation or negation of something concerning something. But a proposition is demonstrative if it is true and is assumed through hypotheses from the beginning. What that means is demonstrative reasoning does not begin with an answer chosen by one with whom we speak. When we take up a proposition as a demonstrative proposition, it's assumed that it's true, that it's self-evident. Or it's assumed through hypotheses from the beginning. That can have a number of different meanings. To see this illustrated, we can simply look at the art of geometry and look at the method used in geometry. And if you haven't studied geometry, I recommend that you get started with geometry. In geometry, we start with either axioms, which are self-evident truths, things that are true, or with definitions and postulates. These are considered hypotheses because they're concessions. They're things that were granted as being acceptable and without any need for proof in our investigation of geometry. So what makes a proposition demonstrative is, first of all, that it assumes an answer. It assumes one part of a contradiction. And secondly, what makes a proposition demonstrative is the material that it starts with, the source of the arguments is self-evident or previously established propositions. Aristotle goes on to explain that a dialectic proposition, on the other hand, a dialectic proposition, before we say what it is, we have to realize that there are two people involved, the one asking the question and the one answering. Aristotle says, with respect to him who inquires, as far as he's concerned who asks the question, like Socrates, with respect to him who inquires, a dialectic proposition is an interrogation, a question, which presents a contradiction. But with respect to him who syllogizes, who actually forms and assembles the arguments, it is an assumption of that which is seen and probable. Notice it doesn't say true, but seen and probable. What that means is a dialectical proposition is based on what is assumed to be true, what is probable, what most people consider to be true, or what a person we're speaking with says he believes is true. And he says that because it's probable or because it's what most men think is true. So demonstrative propositions and dialectical propositions, what really sets them apart is what kind of material each of them starts with. Demonstrative propositions start with propositions that are true, that are self-evident, that are obviously true. Dialectical propositions start with statements that appear to be true or are probable. They're judged by most men to be true and are probably true, but not necessarily. And Aristotle says this is explained in the Topics, which is his book on dialectical reasoning, which we'll study later in classical reasoning. What, therefore, a proposition is, and in what the syllogistic, demonstrative, and dialectic proposition differ from each other, will be accurately shown in the following treatises. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to learn that. You shouldn't understand that yet. We haven't studied it yet. But for the present purpose, what has been determined by us may suffice. So if you understand what I've explained so far, you understand everything that Aristotle says is necessary for you at this point in the study. He now moves on to the definition of these other items that he listed at the beginning of the chapter. He says, I call that a term into which a proposition is dissolved. And this is very simple. A proposition, remember, is a sentence where something is predicated of a subject. The predicate and the subject are the terms of the proposition. They are the parts or the members of the proposition. Just as words are the parts of speech, the terms of a proposition are the parts of the proposition, the subject and the predicate. So he says, I call that a term into which the proposition is dissolved or divided into its parts. As, for instance, that which is predicated, that is the predicate, and that of which it is predicated, that's the subject, the parts of the proposition. The subject and the predicate are the terms of a proposition. He then goes on to define a syllogism, and this is very important. The language here may be a little confusing as you get started, but it's a very simple concept, and I'll explain it. A syllogism is a discourse. Notice a syllogism is not a sentence, but a discourse. It's made up of a number of sentences. A syllogism is a discourse in which certain things being admitted, something else different from these things admitted necessarily happens in consequence of the existence of these admitted propositions. That sentence is a mouthful, but I recommend you memorize that sentence. Memorize that sentence. It's very important. Let's take a look at it and break it down so we can understand it easily. A syllogism is a discourse. As I said, not a sentence, but a collection of sentences, a number of sentences. The number of sentences in a syllogism is actually 3. A syllogism is a discourse made up of 3 propositions in which certain things being admitted. What that means is that when we begin with 2 propositions that are admitted, something else, a third proposition, something else different from the things which were admitted, a new proposition that's different from the 2 propositions we started with, necessarily happens. The reason why it's necessary is because the content of the first 2 premises contains the third premise, and reason puts them together and discovers this third premise, the conclusion or the consequence, as Aristotle says here. I can give you an example of this that will make it very clear. Let's say I start with two propositions. These are the things that are admitted. I say, we will admit that all men are mortal. That's our first proposition, the first thing we admit. All men are mortal. The second thing we're going to admit is that Socrates is a man. All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. Now, when we put these two propositions together and present them to our minds as human beings, the faculty of reason immediately recognizes that there's a relationship between these two propositions, and these two propositions give birth to a child. And this child is the consequence. Listen again, and you'll see that your mind can put these propositions together and discover the third proposition. Ready? All men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. When your mind admits those two propositions, reason goes to work on those propositions, and something else necessarily arises from them, a third proposition which is different from the other two. That third proposition is, therefore, Socrates is mortal. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Then Socrates is immortal. Those three propositions taken together make a syllogism. The consequence or the conclusion necessarily follows the two premises that were admitted. That's what a syllogism is. That's how reasoning works. Reasoning is a power given to us by God that allows us to discover new truth. You can put two true statements into our mind, and our mind will produce a third, new truth if those two sentences have a certain relationship to one another. That's the faculty of reasoning. That's how reasoning works. Reasoning works by syllogisms. Aristotle then goes on to say, when I say that something else happens through these, I mean that there is no need of any external term. In the two propositions, there are three terms. In the two propositions, there are three terms. In the first proposition, we have all men are mortals. We have the subject, all men, a universal proposition, all men. And we have the predicate, are mortals. So far we have two terms, all men and mortals. Or I couldn't say men and mortals. In the second proposition, we have a new term. Socrates, that's the third term, is a man. That second term is the same as the first term in the first proposition. The predicate of the second sentence is contained in the subject of the first sentence. There are three terms in those two propositions. The subject and predicate of the first proposition and the subject of the second proposition. In a syllogism, no other term is necessary for the third proposition to arise from those three terms. And in a syllogism, in all three propositions, there are a total of only three terms. A perfect syllogism, Aristotle says, is that which requires nothing else besides the things assumed in those two predicates. Those two propositions, sorry. A perfect syllogism requires nothing else besides the things assumed in order that the necessary consequence may appear. But an imperfect syllogism is one which requires something else in addition to the terms that are present in those two propositions for a conclusion to be drawn. He then says, it is the same thing for one thing to be in the whole of another, and for one thing to be predicated of the whole of another. It's the same thing for one thing to be in all of another, as it is to be predicated of all of another, when nothing can be assumed of that subject of which the other may not be asserted. What he means here is when we say that something is in the whole of another, when we predicate something universally, we say that this is true of all of this subject. We mean that there is no example, no individual belonging to the class that's named in that subject where we can find that the predicate is not true. The predicate is in the whole of another when nothing can be assumed of the subject of which the other, the predicate, may not be asserted. And to be predicated of nothing has the same idea. If we say that something is predicated of nothing, it means that there's no individual in that class for which that predicate can be true. And that's the end of chapter 1. So these are, I think, simple ideas. They may be new to you, and therefore that because they're unfamiliar, they may appear difficult, but they're not difficult. But they're very important. And so I would advise you to memorize these definitions of these terms. What is a proposition? What are the different kinds of propositions? What is a term? What is a syllogism? What is a perfect and imperfect syllogism? I recommend you memorize those definitions because they're very important. Aristotle's teaching them to us here as the elements of the art of demonstrative reasoning. And you need to make sure that you not only learn them, but that you always keep them in mind with their exact definitions as Aristotle has defined them. Now, my advice to you at this point is to go back and study the lesson over again for mastery. You can listen to the reading of the chapter, and you can listen to this commentary on the chapter as many times as you'd like. Study the lesson for mastery. Make sure you understand everything in the lesson. Read it over and over again until you almost have the whole chapter memorized. If you have any questions, if there's anything in the chapter that you don't understand or you'd like to talk about a little bit more, post your questions on the support forum on the course page in the CLAA Study Center. And I'll answer any questions you have, or I'll do my best to help you find answers to any question you have on that course support forum on the course page. So I hope that's helpful. And like I said, get in touch if you have any questions. Study this lesson for mastery, complete your lesson assessment, and we'll continue our study of Aristotle's prior analytics. God bless your studies.